Paris glimmered in the soft glow of twilight, the Seine reflecting golden streaks from the Eiffel Tower. Karim Al-Farid, heir to the sprawling Al-Farid conglomerate, leaned back in his chair in the gilded auditorium of the Palais Garnier. The moonlight bathed the expansive gardens of the Al-Nasser mansion in a soft glow, illuminating the marble fountains and intricately trimmed hedges. Omar Al-Nasser, heir to one of the most prominent families in the region, often sought solace in these gardens during the quiet hours of the night. Tonight, however, something was different. A melody floated through the air, faint at first, then clearer as he walked closer to the western edge of the property. It wasn't the polished tunes performed by the musicians his family often hired for grand occasions. No, this was raw, soulful, and undeniably beautiful. Omar stopped in his tracks, his curiosity piqued. He followed the sound, his leather shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. The music seemed to pull him, weaving a spell that made him forget the weight of the expectations his family imposed on him. As he approached a secluded corner of the garden, he saw her, a young woman sitting on a low wooden bench beneath the shade of a jasmine tree. She held a violin that had seen better days, its varnish faded and strings slightly frayed. But in her hands, it produced magic. Omar stood frozen, captivated by both the music and the sight of her. When she finished, she startled upon noticing him. Quickly, she lowered the violin and stood, clutching it to her chest as if to protect it from judgment. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "Disturb?" Omar stepped closer, careful not to startle her further. "You weren't disturbing anyone. That was extraordinary." She lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushing under the soft moonlight. "Thank you," she murmured, though she sounded unconvinced. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Layla," she replied, hesitating before adding, "I'm the gardener's daughter." Omar tilted his head, intrigued. "Layla, your music is unlike anything I've ever heard. Who taught you to play?" "My father saved up for lessons when I was younger," she explained, her grip tightening on the violin. "But they became too expensive, so I had to stop. Now, I just play what I feel." The sincerity in her voice struck him, as did the passion evident in her playing. "Have you ever thought about studying music professionally?" Layla laughed softly, but it carried a hint of bitterness. "People like me don't go to conservatories. Those places are for people with money, connections. People like you." Her words stung, though not out of malice. They held a mirror to the privilege he often took for granted. Omar felt a strange, almost overwhelming urge to help her. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "Talent like yours shouldn't be hidden here. It deserves to be heard." Layla looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if unsure whether to trust his sincerity. "And what would you know about my life? About what I deserve?" Her question hung in the air, sharp and poignant. Omar opened his mouth to respond, but realized he didn't have an answer, at least, not one that wouldn't sound condescending. Instead, he chose honesty. "I don't know much," he admitted, "but I do know what I heard tonight, and it moved me." Layla softened slightly, but remained cautious. "Thank you," she said again, this time with a touch more warmth, "but I should go. My father will worry if I stay out too late." As she turned to leave, Omar found himself speaking without thinking. "Would you play for me again sometime?" Layla paused, glancing over her shoulder. "I don't think that would be appropriate." "Why not?" Omar pressed, a small smile playing on his lips. "Music doesn't recognize social classes, does it?" She hesitated, torn between intrigue and propriety. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Maybe. Good night, Mr. Al-Nasser." "Omar," he corrected. "Just Omar." She didn't respond, disappearing down the path that led to the gardener's cottage. Omar remained standing in the garden, the memory of her music lingering in the night air. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose beyond the gilded cage of his lineage. The morning sun filtered through the ornate windows of the Al-Nasser mansion, casting golden patterns on the polished marble floors. Omar sat at the long dining table, his movements slow as he picked at a plate of fruit. His mind drifted back to the melody from the night before and the girl who had played it. Layla. His reverie was interrupted by his father's voice, sharp and commanding. Omar, you've been unusually distracted lately. We need your full attention. Sheikh Khalid al-Nasser, Omar's father, was a man of stature and tradition. His presence dominated any room he entered, his expectations looming as heavily as the portraits of ancestors that lined the walls. Across the table, Omar's mother, adorned in jewels befitting her position, looked on silently but expectantly. Yes, father, Omar replied, straightening in his chair. Khalid set down his coffee cup with precision, his eyes narrowing. As you know, your 25th birthday approaches. It is time for you to take your place in the family business. The company will need strong leadership to carry on our legacy. Omar resisted the urge to sigh. He had grown up hearing about legacy, about duty, about the responsibilities he owed to the al-Nasser name. Yet, it all felt hollow to him, a carefully constructed facade of wealth and tradition that left no room for individuality. I understand, Omar said evenly. There's more, Khalid continued. We've received a proposal from the Hassan family. Their eldest daughter, Yasmin, is an ideal match, well-educated, from a respectable family. We will host them for dinner this week to discuss a possible engagement. The words hit Omar like a blow. His chest tightened as he stared at his father, disbelief flickering across his face. Engagement? Father, This is not a discussion, Omar, Khalid interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. This is about the future of our family. Omar glanced at his mother, hoping for some sign of support, but her expression was unreadable. She rarely intervened in matters Khalid deemed important, and this was no exception. He clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. How could he be expected to marry someone he barely knew, let alone loved? And why did every decision about his life seem to be made without his input? Excuse me, Omar said abruptly, standing from the table. I need some air. Without waiting for permission, he left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Outside, the garden stretched before him, serene and untouched by the turbulence in his heart. Omar wandered aimlessly, his mind replaying the conversation with his father. The idea of being tied to someone like Yasmin, a stranger, no matter how perfect on paper, felt suffocating. He found himself near the western edge of the property again, where the jasmine tree stood. The memory of Layla playing her violin resurfaced, a stark contrast to the rigid expectations of his family. Her music had been free, unbound by rules or tradition, and it called to him now more than ever. Meanwhile, in the small cottage tucked near the far edge of the estate, Layla's morning was far less serene. She knelt beside her father, helping him trim the hedges around the main garden. Her hands moved deftly, though her mind was elsewhere on the man who had watched her play the night before. Her father's voice pulled her back to the present. Layla, you've been quiet all morning. Something on your mind? She hesitated, debating whether to mention Omar. Nothing important, Baba, she said finally. Just thinking about the future. Her father's face softened as he paused his work. You've always dreamed big, Layla. But remember, our lives are simple. It's best not to get caught up in dreams that can't be. Layla nodded, though her chest tightened at his words. She had heard them many times before, a reminder of the limitations imposed by their status, their means. Yet, the memory of Omar's encouragement lingered. Could there be more to life than this? Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Omar stood on the balcony of his room, staring out at the gardens. His thoughts drifted once again to Layla, her defiance, her passion, her ability to create beauty in a life full of constraints. It all fascinated him. But as he watched the mansion staff prepare for the arrival of the Hassan family later that week, reality loomed. His life was already decided, his path laid out by others. And yet, for the first time, he felt a flicker of rebellion stirring within him. He made a decision. If his family could dictate his future, perhaps he could reclaim a small piece of it, starting with a simple conversation. Tomorrow, he would seek out Layla again. The following afternoon, Omar wandered through the estate gardens, his eyes scanning for any sign of Layla. He wasn't entirely sure what he would say to her, but he felt an unshakable pull to see her again. The memory of her music and her quiet defiance had stayed with him, growing louder with each passing hour. He found her near the southern fountain, her violin resting on her lap as she plucked absent-mindedly at the strings. Layla looked up when she heard his footsteps, her expression shifting from surprise to cautious wariness. "You're here again," she said, standing as though ready to retreat. "Shouldn't you be busy running your family's empire?" Omar chuckled, though there was a bitterness to his laugh. "I think my father is more than capable of running the empire without me." She tilted her head, studying him. "Then what are you doing here?" "I came to ask you something." Omar took a tentative step closer, his tone soft but resolute. "There's a recital tomorrow evening at the conservatory. I'd like you to come with me." Layla blinked, her brow furrowing. "What? Why would you ask me that?" "Because I think you belong there," he said simply. "Your music, it's too incredible to stay hidden here. I want you to see what's possible." Layla laughed, but it was dry and sharp. "What's possible? Do you think I can just waltz into a place like that and fit in? I'm the gardener's daughter, remember?" "That doesn't matter," Omar insisted, his voice firm. "Talent doesn't care where you come from." Her gaze dropped to the violin in her hands, her fingers brushing over its worn surface. "It matters to the rest of the world," she muttered. "People like me, we don't get opportunities like that." "Then let me show you otherwise," Omar said, stepping closer. "Just come. No one has to know who you are or where you're from. Let the music speak for itself." Layla hesitated, the conflict evident on her face. She wanted to believe him, to believe in the vision he was painting for her. But years of experience had taught her that the world wasn't so kind. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "and something goes wrong, it won't be you who faces the consequences. It'll be me." Omar met her eyes, his expression earnest. "I promise. I won't let that happen." The day of the recital arrived, and Layla spent hours agonizing over whether she had made the right decision. Her father had noticed her distraction and asked if everything was all right, but she had managed to deflect his questions. When evening fell, she slipped out of the cottage, clutching her violin case tightly. Omar was waiting near the estate's side gate, dressed in a sharp suit that made him look every bit the heir to a great fortune. For a moment, Layla considered turning back, but his warm smile put her at ease. "You look perfect," he said, his voice full of reassurance. She glanced down at her modest dress, her cheeks flushing. "I don't exactly have a closet full of gowns." "You don't need one," Omar replied. "Come on, let's go." The conservatory was a towering structure of glass and stone, its grand facade lit by elegant chandeliers. Layla stared at it in awe as they approached, feeling smaller with every step. Omar guided her through the entrance, nodding politely at acquaintances who glanced curiously at his companion. Inside, the recital hall was breathtaking. Rows of plush seats faced a polished stage, where a grand piano gleamed under soft lighting. The air buzzed with anticipation as the audience murmured in hushed tones. Layla clutched her violin case tighter, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place she felt. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "You should," Omar said firmly, leading her to their seats. "Just watch, listen, you'll see." The recital began with a young pianist performing a complex piece that left the audience in awe. Layla watched intently, her heart swelling with equal parts admiration and envy. She couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to play on a stage like that, to have people hear her music and truly listen. When the first half of the program ended, Omar turned to her with a grin. "What do you think so far?" "It's incredible," she admitted, though her voice was tinged with melancholy. "I don't know if I could ever reach that level." "You're already at that level," Omar countered. "You just don't have the platform yet." Before she could respond, one of the recital organizers approached them. He was a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze that swept over Layla before settling on Omar. "Mar." "Al-Nasser," the man said smoothly. "A pleasure to see you here. And your guest?" "Layla," Omar said quickly. She's an aspiring musician. The man raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Is that so? And what instrument do you play, Miss Layla? The violin, she said softly, her grip tightening on the case. Well, the man said with a slight smile, perhaps we could hear you play sometime. Layla froze, glancing at Omar, who nodded encouragingly. She'd be honored, he said. The man gestured toward the stage. How about now? We have time before the second half begins. The air seemed to leave the room. Layla's pulse raced as panic set in. I'm not ready, she stammered. You are, Omar said, his tone steady. Just play from your heart. That's all you need to do. Layla hesitated, fear and doubt warring within her. But as the audience turned their curious eyes toward her, she knew there was no way out. Swallowing her nerves, she stood and followed the organizer to the stage. As she stepped into the spotlight, the room fell silent. Layla took a deep breath, her trembling hands raising the bow to the strings. She closed her eyes and began to play. The first notes were hesitant, but as she lost herself in the music, her confidence grew. The melody flowed, raw and unfiltered, filling the hall with emotion. When she finished, the audience erupted into applause, their appreciation echoing through the space. Layla stepped back from the stage, her heart pounding. She met Omar's gaze in the crowd, his expression beaming with pride. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he had been right after all. Layla stepped off the stage, her legs unsteady, but her heart alight with a feeling she hadn't experienced before. Triumph. The applause still rang in her ears, and for a brief moment, the doubts that had followed her all her life seemed insignificant. Omar was waiting for her near the side of the stage, his expression a mixture of pride and quiet satisfaction. You were incredible, he said, his voice low so only she could hear. Layla managed a small smile, still trying to process what had just happened. I can't believe I did that. I told you, talent like yours deserves to be heard. Before she could respond, a cluster of attendees approached them. At the forefront was the same organizer who had invited Layla to play, now wearing a wide grin. Miss Layla, he said, that was unexpected and remarkable. Layla opened her mouth to thank him, but before she could speak, another voice interrupted. Remarkable, yes, but who is she exactly? The question came from a woman dressed in an expensive gown, her tone sharp and suspicious. Her eyes flicked over Layla, then shifted to Omar. And why is she with you, Omar? Layla's stomach dropped as the murmurs began. People whispered behind their hands, their gazes flitting between her and Omar. She could feel the judgment, the unspoken question on their lips. What was someone like her doing here? She's a friend, Omar said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. An extraordinarily talented musician. The woman raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. A friend? Interesting. And where does this friend come from? Layla's throat tightened. She had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. Omar placed a steadying hand on her arm, but she could feel the tension in his grip. She's from here, he said, his voice calm but with an edge of warning. Her talent is what matters, not her background. The woman scoffed, and a man beside her chuckled softly. Very noble of you, Omar, but you know how things work in our world. The conversation had drawn a small crowd now, and Layla felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her. She clutched her violin case tightly, her earlier pride evaporating under the scrutiny. I think we should leave, she whispered to Omar, her voice trembling. But before they could retreat, someone else in the crowd recognized her. Wait, she's the gardener's daughter, isn't she? The words sliced through the murmurs like a blade, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Layla's breath hitched. The crowd's curiosity turned into something colder, sharper. She saw the sneers, the raised eyebrows, the way people began to whisper louder, no longer bothering to hide their disdain. Omar stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. Enough, he said, his tone commanding. Yes, she's the gardener's daughter, and she's also the most gifted musician in this room. If anyone here has a problem with that, then perhaps they should reevaluate their priorities. His words caused a brief silence, but it didn't last. The murmurs resumed, and Layla knew that while Omar's defense was heartfelt, it wouldn't change how these people saw her. The organizer cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the tension. "Perhaps we should continue with the evening's program," he suggested, gesturing for everyone to return to their seats. Layla felt Omar's hand on her arm again, guiding her toward the exit. She didn't resist. The recital hall, once a place of wonder and possibility, now felt suffocating. Outside, the cool night air hit her like a wave, and she gulped it down, trying to steady herself. Omar stayed silent beside her, his expression unreadable. Finally, she stopped walking and turned to him. "I told you this would happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I told you." "And they were wrong," Omar replied, his voice firm. "They don't matter, Layla. What matters is what you did in there. You played brilliantly, and you proved that you belong on that stage." Layla shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "It's not that simple, Omar. People like me don't get to just step into your world without consequences. My father, what if this gets back to him? What if—" "It won't," Omar interrupted. "I'll make sure of it." Layla looked at him, her chest tightening. She wanted to believe him, to believe in his conviction. But the night's events had shown her just how deep the divide between their worlds truly was. "I need to go home," she said softly, turning away before he could respond. Omar watched her disappear into the night, frustration and guilt churning within him. He had wanted to show her that her talent could transcend the barriers of class, but instead, he had exposed her to the very prejudices he despised. As he returned to the mansion, his father's words echoed in his mind. "Our world has rules, Omar. Break them, and there are consequences." For the first time, Omar began to understand the full weight of those words and the battle that lay ahead. The early morning light seeped through the small windows of the gardener's cottage as Layla sat at the kitchen table, staring at her violin case. The joy of playing on stage had faded, replaced by an overwhelming dread. Her father's soft humming came from outside, where he tended to the flower beds. He didn't know about last night, but the weight of secrecy pressed heavily on her chest. When her father entered, wiping his hands on a rag, he noticed her pensive expression. "Layla, you've been sitting there for hours. What's wrong?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting on the table. "Nothing, Baba. Just tired." Her father gave her a searching look, but didn't press further. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat across from her. "You work hard, Layla, but sometimes you think too much. Life is simpler than you make it." Layla forced a smile, though his words only deepened her internal conflict. Simpler. That's what her life was supposed to be, wasn't it? A quiet existence helping her father, keeping to her place. But her music refused to let her stay confined. Across the estate, Omar sat in his study, staring out the window at the sprawling gardens. The events of the previous evening gnawed at him. He had wanted to prove to Layla that her talent could shine beyond the confines of her world, but instead he had inadvertently exposed her to ridicule. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His mother entered, her movements graceful but deliberate. "Omar," she began, her tone neutral, "there's something we need to discuss." He turned to face her, his jaw tightening. "If it's about last night—" "It is," she interrupted. "You've caused quite a stir. People are talking, and not in a favorable way." "I don't care what they think," Omar said firmly. "You should," she replied, her voice hardening. "Your actions don't just affect you, Omar. They reflect on all of us on the Al Nasser name. You cannot associate with people who what?" He interrupted, standing. "Who don't come from money, who don't fit neatly into the little boxes this family and its peers have created." His mother's eyes narrowed, though she kept her composure. "This is not about boxes, Omar. It's about understanding the world we live in. If you think you can change it by parading a gardener's daughter in front of society, you're being naive." "It's not parading," he snapped. "She's a musician and artist, and she deserves to be seen for her talent, not dismissed because of where she comes from." His mother sighed, her expression softening just slightly. "Omar, I know you want to do what's right, But sometimes doing what's right means understanding when to fight and when to step back. I'm not stepping back, he said, his voice resolute. By midday, Omar found Layla in the garden, her hands busy pruning roses. She barely looked at him when he approached, her movements sharp and deliberate. "Layla," he said softly, "can we talk?" She didn't stop working. "What's there to talk about? I told you this would happen." "Layla, I'm sorry," Omar said, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't mean for things to go that way." She paused, finally meeting his gaze. "But they did. And now I'm the one who has to worry about what happens next. What if word gets back to my father? What if your family decides I'm too much of a problem?" "They won't," Omar insisted. "I'll make sure of it." "You can't make sure of anything, Omar," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand what it's like to live in fear of losing everything, because you've never had to." Her words cut deep, but he knew she wasn't wrong. Omar reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Then let me help. Let me make it right." Layla hesitated, her eyes searching his for sincerity. "How?" "I've been looking into conservatories," he said, his voice quickening. "There's a program for promising musicians, and I know someone who can help get your application noticed." Layla shook her head. "I can't afford that, even if I got in." "I'll cover it," Omar said without hesitation. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "No, I can't let you do that." "Why not?" "Because it's not your responsibility," she exclaimed. "I won't be your charity case, Omar." "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's belief. I believe in you, Layla. Your music deserves a chance, and if this is how I can help, then let me." She looked at him, her expression a mix of frustration and longing. "I need to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Omar said, stepping back to give her space. "But just know, I'm not giving up on this. Or on you." As he walked away, Layla sat back on her heels, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he could help her escape the constraints of her world. But the risks were high, and the consequences of failure felt unbearable. The sun hung low in the sky as Layla sat beneath the jasmine tree, her violin resting on her lap. For hours, she had been going over Omar's words, replaying them in her mind, like the notes of a difficult piece she couldn't quite master. "Let me help you. Your music deserves a chance." She wanted to believe him, but the idea of accepting his help filled her with unease. Layla had spent her whole life being reminded of her place by her father, by the estate workers, by the glances of the Al Nasser family and their guests. Could she really step into a world that wasn't meant for her? A rustling sound broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Omar approaching. He wasn't wearing his usual polished demeanor. His shirt was slightly untucked, and there was an urgency in his steps. "Have you decided?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. Layla hesitated, her fingers brushing the strings of her violin. "I'm not sure." "Layla," he said, his tone softer now. "I understand why you're hesitant, but this isn't about charity or obligation. This is about your talent, your future." "And what about my father?" she countered, her voice low. "What will happen to him if people start talking?" "If your family, I'll handle it," Omar interrupted. "Whatever happens, I'll make sure your father is protected. You have my word." She studied his face, searching for any trace of insincerity, but all she saw was determination. "And you really think I can get in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you can," he replied. "There's a program for promising musicians, one that looks beyond status and connections. I've already spoken to someone at the conservatory, and they're willing to hear you play." Layla's breath hitched. The idea of playing for an actual admissions committee made her heart race with both excitement and terror. "When?" she asked. "Next week," Omar said. "You'll need to prepare a piece, something that shows who you are as an artist." Her hands tightened around the violin. "What if I fail?" "You won't," Omar said, stepping closer. "But even if you do, at least you'll know you tried. Isn't that better than wondering what could have been?" Layla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her violin, her reflection shimmering faintly in its worn surface. She thought about the joy she felt whenever she played, the way the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the music. Maybe it was worth the risk. "Okay," she said finally, lifting her gaze to meet his. "I'll do it." Omar's face broke into a smile, relief evident in his eyes. "You won't regret this, Layla, I promise." The following days passed in a blur of practice. Layla spent every spare moment honing her skills, pushing herself to perfect a piece that would capture the essence of her passion. Her father noticed her newfound intensity, but didn't question it, chalking it up to her usual dedication to music. Omar, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to ensure the audition would go smoothly. He called in favors, spoke to his contacts at the conservatory, and prepared for the inevitable fallout from his family. His father had already begun questioning his frequent absences, and Omar knew it was only a matter of time before the full weight of the Al Nasser expectations came crashing down. On the day of the audition, Omar arrived at the gardener's cottage early in the morning. Layla was waiting for him, her violin case in hand and a nervous energy radiating from her. She wore a simple dress, her hair neatly tied back, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You ready?" Omar asked as they walked toward his car. "As ready as I'll ever be," Layla replied, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. The drive to the conservatory was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Layla stared at the grand building with wide eyes, the enormity of the moment sinking in. "This is it," Omar said, his voice steady. "Just breathe and play like you always do." Layla nodded, gripping her violin case tightly as they walked inside. The admissions hall was intimidating, with its high ceilings and portraits of accomplished musicians lining the walls. Omar led her to a small waiting area outside the audition room. "You'll be fine," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll be right here." Layla gave him a small, grateful smile before stepping into the room. Inside, a panel of 3 judges sat behind a long table, their expressions neutral but expectant. Layla's heart pounded as she introduced herself, her voice barely audible. When she lifted the violin to her shoulder, everything else faded away. The weight of the room, the stares of the judges, the fear of failure, it all dissolved as the first note rang out. She played with everything she had, pouring her emotions into every movement of the bow. By the time she finished, she was trembling, unsure of how she had done. The judges exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. One of them finally spoke. "Thank you, Miss Layla. We'll be in touch." She nodded and left the room, her knees weak as she returned to the waiting area. Omar stood as she approached, searching her face for a sign of how it had gone. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaky. I think I did my best." "That's all that matters," Omar said with a reassuring smile. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." As they walked back to the car, Layla felt a glimmer of hope stirring in her chest. For the first time, the possibility of a different future didn't seem so impossible. The days following Layla's audition felt like an eternity. She threw herself into her routine, trying to distract herself from the uncertainty that loomed over her. Every time the thought of the conservatory crossed her mind, a pang of anxiety followed. Had she done enough? Did her music move them? Or had they dismissed her as an outsider the moment she walked in? Omar visited the gardens almost daily, offering words of encouragement and updates from his contacts. Though his optimism never wavered, Layla's doubts persisted. She had taken the biggest risk of her life, but now, all she could do was wait. One afternoon, Omar arrived at the cottage with a letter in hand. Layla was tending to the hydrangeas when she noticed him walking briskly toward her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "This just came," he said, holding the envelope out to her. The conservatory's insignia was embossed in the corner, and Layla's heart skipped a beat. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. She glanced at Omar, who gave her a reassuring nod, and then carefully tore it open. Her eyes scanned the letter, her breath catching on the words. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They said no." Omar's expression fell. "What?" He took the letter from her hands, reading it himself. The words were polite but firm in apology for the rejection, citing the high volume of applicants and limited spots. It was a standard response, but to Lila, it felt like a personal condemnation. "I knew this would happen," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I shouldn't have even tried." "Layla," Omar said, his voice filled with determination, "this doesn't mean anything. One rejection doesn't define your talent." "It's not just one rejection," she snapped, her emotions spilling over. "It's proof that I don't belong in that world. They saw me for what I am, a nobody." "You're not a nobody," Omar said, stepping closer. "You're one of the most talented musicians I've ever met. This isn't the end. We'll find another way." "Another way?" Layla shook her head, bitterness creeping into her voice. "You don't understand, Omar. People like you have endless chances. People like me, we only get one." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the silence. Omar looked at her, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll make them see. If they won't give you a chance, we'll force them to recognize your talent." Layla stared at him, unsure whether to feel comforted or frustrated by his determination. "And how are we supposed to do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Leave that to me," Omar said. "But promise me one thing, you won't give up." Layla hesitated, the sting of rejection still fresh. But when she met Omar's gaze, she saw an unwavering belief that made her want to try again. Slowly, she nodded. That evening, Omar returned to his family's mansion, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed a way to elevate Layla's profile, to prove that her talent was undeniable. As he paced his room, an idea began to take shape. The next morning, he made a call to his old music teacher, a respected figure in the city's artistic community. The teacher, intrigued by Omar's description of Layla's talent, agreed to meet her. When Omar told Layla about the meeting, she was hesitant. "What if they're just like the conservatory?" she asked. "They won't be," Omar assured her. "This isn't about fitting into their world. It's about showing them who you are." Layla reluctantly agreed, though doubts still lingered in her heart. The meeting was set for the following week, giving her time to prepare another piece. Despite her apprehension, she practiced tirelessly, pouring all her frustration and hope into her music. The day of the meeting arrived, and Omar accompanied Layla to the teacher's home, a modest but elegant apartment filled with musical instruments and scores. The teacher, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, greeted them warmly. "Layla," he said after introductions, "Omar has told me about your talent. I'm eager to hear you play." Layla nodded, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. She lifted her violin and began to play, choosing a piece that had always resonated deeply with her. The music flowed effortlessly, each note filled with emotion and purpose. By the time she finished, the teacher was smiling. "You have a rare gift," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your technique is rough in places, but your passion is undeniable." Layla's heart lifted slightly at his words. "Does that mean you think I have a chance?" "Talent like yours always has a chance," the teacher replied. "But the path won't be easy. Are you willing to work hard?" "Yes," Layla said without hesitation. "Good," the teacher said. "Then let's get started." As Layla began her lessons with the teacher, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Though the rejection from the conservatory still stung, this new opportunity gave her hope. Omar's faith in her had been the catalyst, but now it was her own determination that kept her moving forward. Omar, meanwhile, watched her progress with pride. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time, he felt that they were moving closer to breaking through the barriers that had held her back. Together, they had taken the first step toward proving that talent and perseverance could defy even the most entrenched obstacles. The warm glow of late afternoon sunlight filled the music teacher's apartment as Layla ended her practice session with a flourish. Her instructor, Mr. Hassan, nodded approvingly, stroking his silver beard as he offered his critique. "You're improving," he said. "Your tone is richer, your phrasing more deliberate, but you still hesitate in moments that require boldness." Layla frowned, lowering her violin. I'm trying, but sometimes it feels overwhelming, like I'm fighting against more than just the music. You are, mister, Hassan replied simply. But remember this, music is meant to break barriers. It's not confined by the rules others try to impose. Play as though the world is yours. Layla absorbed his words, her resolve hardening. I'll do better, she promised. Meanwhile, Omar had his own plans unfolding. He had spent days reaching out to contacts, hoping to find allies who could help Layla gain recognition. His persistence led him to an unexpected source, Yasmin Hassan, the daughter of his family's longtime business partners and the woman his parents had tried to pair him with. Yasmin was a pianist and had studied at the very conservatory that had rejected Layla. Though their relationship had always been polite but distant, Omar decided to take a chance. When they met at a quiet cafe in the city, Yasmin regarded him with curiosity. I have to admit, I was surprised when you reached out, she said, sipping her tea. What's this about? I need your help, Omar said, cutting straight to the point. There's a musician, Layla. She's incredibly talented, but was rejected by the conservatory. I want to give her another chance. Yasmin raised an eyebrow. And why is this so important to you? Omar hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because she deserves it. And because I believe talent shouldn't be confined by where someone comes from. Yasmin studied him for a moment before leaning back in her chair. You're serious about this? I am, he said. I know you have influence there. If you could just open a door for her, get her music in front of the right people, it could change everything. Yasmin tapped her fingers on the table, considering his request. You know, the conservatory isn't just about talent. It's about politics, reputation. Even if I agree to help, there's no guarantee they'll listen. I know, Omar said, but Layla deserves a chance. That's all I'm asking for. Yasmin sighed, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You've always been stubborn, haven't you? Omar smiled faintly. Only when it matters. All right, she said, setting her cup down. I'll see what I can do. But you owe me, Omar. Anything, he said, relief washing over him. Later that evening, Omar shared the news with Layla as they walked through the estate gardens. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. So, you're asking Yasmin to vouch for me? She asked after a pause. Yes, Omar said. She has connections there. If anyone can get them to reconsider, it's her. Layla frowned, her steps slowing. And what does she think of all this? Of me? She respects talent, Omar said. That's all that matters. Layla looked away, doubt flickering in her eyes. I'm not sure I can trust someone like her. You don't have to trust her, Omar said gently. Just trust me. Layla met his gaze, her uncertainty melting into something closer to determination. Okay, if you believe this can work, I'll try. True to her word, Yasmin contacted the conservatory and arranged for Layla's recordings to be reviewed by a panel of influential members. It wasn't a full audition, but it was enough to give her music a second chance. In the meantime, Mr. Hassan intensified Layla's training, pushing her beyond her comfort zone. If you want them to notice you, you need to show them something they've never seen before, he said during one session. What makes your music yours? Layla thought about his question as she practiced late into the night. She poured every ounce of her passion, frustration, and hope into her playing, shaping a piece that felt deeply personal. By the time she finished, her fingers were raw, but her heart felt lighter. The day the panel was set to review Layla's recordings, Omar and Yasmin waited anxiously for news. Yasmin had accompanied Omar to the conservatory, using her influence to ensure that Layla's music received a fair hearing. As the panel listened, Omar couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Layla's music was unlike anything he had ever heard, raw, emotional, and unapologetically unique. He glanced at Yasmin, who nodded subtly, her expression softening. When the session ended, one of the panel members approached Yasmin. This is unconventional, he said, his tone hesitant. But there's something here. We'll need to discuss further. It wasn't an outright acceptance, but it was a crack in the door, a chance. Omar felt a spark of hope ignite within him. That evening, Omar met Layla in the garden to share the news. She listened intently, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. "So they didn't say no?" she asked cautiously. "They didn't say no," Omar confirmed. "They're interested. It's not a guarantee, but it's a step forward." Layla exhaled slowly, a small smile breaking through her guarded expression. "That's more than I expected." "It's more than enough," Omar said. "You've already proven you belong there. Now it's just a matter of time." Layla looked at him, her doubts slowly giving way to a flicker of belief. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so far out of reach. The Al Masr mansion was unusually quiet that evening, the air thick with tension as Omar sat in his father's study. Sheikh Khalid leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "You've been acting recklessly, Omar," his father said, his voice low but filled with authority. "First, there's the matter of your association with that girl. Now, I hear whispers that you're involving outsiders Yasmin, no less, in your schemes." Omar met his father's gaze, refusing to flinch. "It's not a scheme, father. Layla is talented, and I'm helping her find the recognition she deserves." "She's a gardener's daughter," Khalid snapped. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? About her, about you?" "I don't care what they're saying," Omar replied, his voice steady. "Her talent has nothing to do with her background." "That's where you're wrong," Khalid said, his tone cold. "In our world, everything is about background, reputation. You're jeopardizing not only your future, but this family's standing." Omar clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You always talk about legacy and duty, but what about doing what's right? What about using our influence to help people who actually deserve it?" Khalid's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, silence filled the room. Then, in an unexpected shift, his father's voice softened. "You remind me of your mother." Omar blinked, taken aback. "What?" Khalid rose from his chair and moved to the large window overlooking the gardens. "When I first met your mother, she was nothing like the woman you know today. She was spirited, defiant. She wanted to break free from the expectations placed on her." Omar frowned, trying to reconcile this image with the composed, dutiful woman he had always known. What happened? Khalid turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "She made sacrifices for the family, for our legacy. She gave up dreams, ambitions, parts of herself, because that's what it takes to maintain what we have." A weight settled on Omar's chest as he absorbed his father's words. "And you think that was worth it? That her dreams were less important than the family name?" "It's not about worth," Khalid said. "It's about survival. The world isn't kind to those who stray from their place." Omar shook his head, anger rising. "I don't want to survive, father. I want to live. And I won't ask anyone, least of all Layla, to give up their dreams for some outdated sense of honor." Khalid's jaw tightened, his silence heavy with disapproval. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "And you'll learn, as your mother did, that mistakes come at a cost." Later that night, Omar sought out his mother, finding her in the library surrounded by books she rarely had time to read. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening. "Omar," she said, closing the book in her lap. "What's troubling you?" He hesitated, then sat beside her. "Father told me about you, about sacrifices you made for the family." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Your father has a way of simplifying things," she said finally. "Yes, I made sacrifices, but they weren't all because of him. Some were my choices." "Why?" Omar asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you give up parts of yourself for this?" She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Because I believed it was necessary. For you, for your future. But that doesn't mean it was easy. Or right?" Omar leaned forward, his frustration giving way to sadness. "Do you regret it?" She reached out, placing a hand on his. "I regret the parts of myself I silenced. But I don't regret when it gave me a family, a son I'm proud of." Her words hung in the air, bittersweet and full of unspoken truths. Omar met her gaze, searching for something permission, perhaps, or understanding. "I don't want to be like that," he said softly. "I don't want to force someone else to make those kinds of sacrifices." His mother squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. "Then don't. Be better than we were. But know that it won't be easy." The next morning, Omar found Layla practicing beneath the jasmine tree. Her music filled the air, weaving a melody that was both hopeful and melancholic. He stood silently for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. When she noticed him, she lowered her violin, a small smile touching her lips. "You're up early. I needed to talk to you," he said, sitting on the bench beside her. "About last night." "About my family." Layla frowned, concern flickering in her eyes. "Did something happen?" Omar hesitated, then nodded. "My father reminded me of what this fight is going to cost. Not just for me, but for you too." Layla's grip on her violin tightened. "And what do you think it's going to cost?" "Everything," he admitted, "but I'm willing to pay it. I just need to know if you are too." She looked at him, her expression steady despite the weight of his words. "Omar, I've spent my whole life being told what I can't do. What's too risky? Too impossible? I've already made my choice." Omar felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together." Layla nodded, her resolve unwavering. Together. The evening of the local music showcase arrived with a buzz of excitement in the air. The event was held in the city's cultural center, a venue known for giving emerging artists their first taste of the spotlight. Layla stood backstage, her violin case in hand, her heart pounding in her chest. Around her, other musicians warmed up, their chatter filling the space. "You're going to be amazing," Omar said softly, standing by her side. He had been her anchor through the chaotic weeks of preparation. But now, as the moment approached, the weight of the performance seemed overwhelming. "What if I'm not?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I freeze? Or they don't like me?" "They will," Omar said with quiet conviction. "Play like you always do. Play for yourself, not for them." Layla nodded, drawing a deep breath. She had spent countless hours practicing, pouring her emotions into every note. Now, it was time to let the music speak for itself. The auditorium was packed. Layla peeked out from behind the curtain, her stomach twisting as she saw the sea of faces, some eager, some indifferent, and a few familiar ones. Among them were Yasmin, who had come to show her support, and Ammar. Hassan, whose quiet encouragement had been a constant source of strength. As her name was called, Layla stepped onto the stage, her legs shaky but steadying with each step. The applause was polite but subdued, a stark reminder that she was an unknown among the more polished performers of the evening. She positioned herself in the center of the stage, her violin gleaming under the spotlight. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, doubt crept in. But then she closed her eyes, shutting out the crowd, and drew her bow across the strings. The first note resonated, clear and bold, filling the space with a sound that seemed to reach into every corner of the room. Layla played with everything she had, her music weaving a story of longing, defiance, and hope. Each phrase was deliberate, each pause heavy with meaning. She wasn't just playing for the audience, she was playing for herself, for her father, for the dreams she had dared to believe in. By the time she finished, the room was silent. The final note hung in the air for a breathless moment before the applause began. It started hesitantly, then grew, swelling into a wave of sound that brought tears to Layla's eyes. She bowed deeply, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and disbelief. As she left the stage, she caught Omar's eye in the audience. His smile was wide, his pride unmistakable. Backstage, Layla was met with congratulations from the other performers and even some of the event organizers. Yasmin approached her, a soft smile on her lips. "You were extraordinary," Yasmin said. "That was unlike anything I've heard." Layla blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she managed, her voice quiet. "You've made your mark tonight," Yasmin continued. "But this is just the beginning. You need to keep pushing, keep growing." Layla nodded, her determination renewed. The evening had shown her what was possible, but she knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges. Later, As the event wound down, Omar found Layla outside the venue, standing under a canopy of stars. She was holding her violin case tightly, her expression a mixture of joy and exhaustion. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Layla turned to him, a small smile breaking through. "I still can't believe it." "You don't have to," Omar said, "because it's real. They saw what I've always seen." Layla looked at him, her gratitude shining in her eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," he said with a grin. "You just didn't know it yet." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the evening settling over them. For the first time, Layla felt like she had taken a step into a world that had always seemed unreachable. But not everyone was celebrating. As Omar and Layla spoke quietly outside the venue, whispers circulated among a group of onlookers. One of them, a member of Omar's extended family, had recognized him and was already crafting a story to take back to the Al Nasser household. By the time Omar and Layla returned to their respective homes, the seeds of a new conflict had already been sown. The next morning, Omar was summoned to his father's study. The tone of the messenger and the rigid atmosphere of the house made it clear this wasn't a casual meeting. Omar's chest tightened as he walked through the grand halls, knowing this confrontation had been inevitable. When he entered, his father stood by the large window, his back to the door. His mother sat in a corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression unreadable. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. "Close the door," Khalid said without turning around. Omar obeyed, the click of the door echoing in the silence. He stood tall, waiting for his father to speak. When Khalid finally turned, his face was a mask of restrained fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Khalid's voice was low, but each word carried the weight of his anger. "You've humiliated this family, Omar. People are talking about you, about her." "Let them talk," Omar said evenly. "I'm not ashamed of anything I've done." "Not ashamed?" Khalid stepped closer, his voice rising. "You've associated with someone far beneath your station, paraded her in front of society, and now our family name is being dragged through the mud." Omar met his father's gaze, his own temper rising. "What's being dragged through the mud is your narrow view of the world. Layla is talented, hardworking, and more deserving of respect than half the people in that society you care so much about." "This isn't about her talent," Khalid snapped. "This is about how the world works. You don't get to rewrite the rules because you think they're unfair." "Maybe it's time someone did," Omar shot back. Khalid's face darkened, and for a moment, silence filled the room. Then he spoke, his voice cold and deliberate. "You leave me no choice, Omar. If you continue down this path, you'll do so without this family's support." Omar's heart sank, but he didn't let his father see his hesitation. "If that's what it takes, so be it." "You would give up everything?" Khalid asked, incredulous. "The company, your inheritance, your future?" "I'm not giving up my future," Omar said firmly. "I'm choosing one that's mine, not the one you've decided for me." Khalid stared at him, his jaw tight. "Then you're no longer my son." The words landed like a blow, but Omar didn't flinch. He turned to his mother, hoping for some sign of support, but her face was pale, her eyes filled with unspoken sorrow. "I'm sorry, Mother," he said softly, "but I can't live my life on someone else's terms." She didn't respond, and the silence was all the answer he needed. With a heavy heart, Omar left the room, knowing there was no turning back. Meanwhile, at the Gardener's cottage, Layla was facing her own reckoning. Her father had heard about the performance from the estate workers, and while their praise for her music had been genuine, their whispers about her relationship with Omar had been anything but. "Layla," her father said, his tone heavy with concern, "I need to know the truth. What's going on between you and Omar?" Layla hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on her. "He's been helping me," she said finally, "with my music. That's all." Her father's expression hardened. "That's not what people are saying. They think you're trying to climb above your station." "I'm not trying to climb anything," Layla said, her voice trembling. "I just want to play music, to have a chance." "And you think they'll let you?" he asked, his voice rising. These people don't see us as equals, Layla. They'll use you, and when they're done, they'll throw you aside. Tears welled in her eyes. Omar is not like that. He believes in me. Belief won't protect you, her father said, his tone softening. I've worked hard to keep you safe, to give you a simple, honest life. I don't want to see you hurt. I know, Baba, Layla said, her voice breaking, but this is something I have to do. Her father sighed heavily, the lines on his face deepening. Then be careful, Layla. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise, she said, though the path ahead felt more uncertain than ever. That evening, Omar found Layla practicing beneath the jasmine tree, her bow moving with sharp, deliberate strokes. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes narrowing. What happened? She asked, reading the tension in his face. They disowned me, Omar said simply. Layla froze. What? My father. My family. They said, if I keep helping you, I'm no longer welcome in their world. Layla's chest tightened with guilt and fear. Omar, you didn't have to. I did, he interrupted. Because this is the right thing to do. And because I believe in you, Layla, no matter what it costs. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. You shouldn't have to give up everything for me. It's not for you, he said gently. It's for us. For the kind of world we want to build. Layla looked at him, her heart aching with a mix of gratitude and sadness. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but Omar's unwavering support gave her strength. Together, they stood beneath the jasmine tree, their resolve solidifying against the challenges to come. The night of Layla's most important performance arrived. It was a gala organized by Mr. Hassan, her mentor, held at one of the city's most prestigious cultural venues. The audience was a mix of influential figures, musicians, and critics, all eager to discover new talent. For Layla, this was more than a performance. It was her chance to prove herself and defy the expectations that had always held her back. Backstage, Layla adjusted the bow on her violin with trembling hands. Omar stood beside her, his presence a steadying force. You've got this, he said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. Layla nodded, drawing a deep breath. I hope so. You don't need to hope, Omar replied. You're ready. The auditorium was packed. Layla peeked through the curtain and saw a sea of faces, some familiar, many not. Her heart raced as she spotted members of the conservatory's admissions panel among the crowd. Tonight was more than just a performance. It was a second chance. When her name was announced, she stepped onto the stage, the applause polite but reserved. She positioned herself in the spotlight, lifting her violin to her shoulder. The silence in the room was deafening, every eye fixed on her. Then, she began to play. The first notes were soft and tentative, like a whisper in the dark. But as the melody unfolded, her confidence grew. Her bow danced across the strings, drawing out a sound so rich and full of emotion that the audience leaned forward in their seats. Her piece was an original composition, a blend of classical structure and her own raw, unfiltered voice. It told a story of struggle and hope, of breaking free from chains and daring to dream. Each note carried the weight of her journey, and as she played, she felt the room fade away, leaving only the music. When the final note hung in the air, the silence was absolute. For a moment, Layla wondered if she had failed to move them, but then the applause erupted, rising like a wave and washing over her. It was thunderous, genuine, and overwhelming. Layla bowed deeply, tears brimming in her eyes as she left the stage. Backstage, Omar was waiting for her, his expression radiant with pride. You were incredible, he said, pulling her into a brief but warm embrace. I can't believe it, Layla whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. They actually liked it. They didn't just like it, Omar said with a grin. They loved it. As the gala continued, Layla found herself surrounded by people, critics, musicians, and even members of the conservatory's admissions panel, all eager to speak with her. For the first time, she felt like she belonged in their world, not as an outsider, but as a peer. One of the conservatory members approached her with a smile. Miss Layla, he said, extending a hand, your performance tonight was remarkable. We were wrong to overlook you before. I hope you'll consider reapplying. You have a place with us." Layla stared at him, her heart swelling with a mix of disbelief and joy. "Thank you," she said softly. "I would be honored." But the night was not without its shadows. As Layla basked in her triumph, a small group of Omar's extended family members whispered among themselves in a corner of the room. They had been watching closely, their expressions a mix of disdain and curiosity. When the gala ended and the crowd began to disperse, one of them approached Omar. "Impressive," the man said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You've certainly made a spectacle of yourself tonight." Omar's smile didn't falter. "If helping someone show the world their talent is a spectacle, then I'm happy to oblige." The man scoffed, leaning closer. "You think this will last? You think you can build a life with someone like her and not face consequences?" Omar's expression hardened, but his voice remained calm. "The only consequence I care about is not living authentically. If you can't understand that, then this conversation is over." With that, he turned away, rejoining Layla as she stood near the exit. She noticed the tension in his posture and touched his arm gently. "Everything okay?" she asked. "It is now," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. As they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around them. Layla looked up at the stars, her violin case in one hand and Omar's in the other. For the first time, the world didn't feel so overwhelming. It felt open, full of possibility. "What happens next?" she asked softly. "Whatever we want," Omar said, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning." Layla smiled, a quiet determination shining in her eyes. "Then let's make it count." Together, they walked into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. A month after the gala, life for Layla and Omar had shifted in ways they never could have imagined. Layla was now a student at the prestigious conservatory, her talent finally recognized by the institution that had once dismissed her. Each day was a whirlwind of lessons, practice sessions, and opportunities that filled her heart with excitement and purpose. But with this newfound success came a fresh set of challenges. As she walked through the conservatory's grand hallways, she often felt the weight of being an outsider. Though her peers were mostly kind, there were subtle reminders of her background comments about her unique journey or the well-meaning but patronizing compliments about how far she had come. Layla learned to focus on what mattered most, the music. Her days were filled with it, her violin becoming an extension of herself as she worked tirelessly to hone her skills. Though the journey was far from easy, the progress she made filled her with pride. For Omar, life had also taken a drastic turn. Cut off from his family's wealth and influence, he had to learn to navigate the world on his own terms. He moved into a modest apartment in the city and took up work at a local art foundation, using his skills and connections to support emerging artists. The adjustment was humbling but liberating. For the first time, Omar felt a sense of ownership over his life. Though he missed the comforts of his old world, he found joy in building something meaningful, both for himself and for others. His relationship with Layla deepened during this time. Despite their busy schedules, they made a point to meet regularly, often spending evenings in the city's parks or at small cafes where they dreamed about the future. One such evening, as they sat by a quiet lake, Layla leaned her head against Omar's shoulder. The soft sound of water lapping against the shore filled the silence between them. "I don't think I've ever been this tired," she said with a laugh. "But it's the kind of tired that feels worth it." Omar smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're doing something incredible, Layla, and you're just getting started." She looked at him, her expression turning serious. "What about you? Do you ever regret walking away from everything?" "Not for a second," Omar said without hesitation. "I finally feel like I'm living a life that's mine, and I get to see you chase your dreams. That's more than enough." Layla's eyes softened. "I'm glad you're here with me." "Always," he replied. As the weeks turned into months, Layla's talent began to gain recognition beyond the conservatory. She was invited to perform at regional concerts, where her music captivated audiences and critics alike. Her performances were described as hauntingly beautiful and a voice that transcends barriers. Omar, too, found his stride at the Art Foundation. His passion for supporting underprivileged artists earned him respect and admiration from his colleagues. Together, he and Layla began to envision ways to use their experiences to help others, dreaming of a future where talent, not privilege, determined one's opportunities. But the shadow of the Al Nasser family lingered. Though Omar had distanced himself from their world, he couldn't entirely escape their influence. Rumors swirled about his relationship with Layla, and while most were harmless, a few carried undertones of malice. One evening, Yasmin reached out to Omar. They met at a quiet cafe, where she spoke candidly about the whispers circulating among their mutual acquaintances. "You're doing good work, Omar," she said, her tone sincere. "But not everyone will see it that way. Some people are waiting for you to fail." "I know," Omar said, his voice steady. "But I'm not doing this for them. Let them wait." Yasmin smiled faintly. "Just be careful. The world you've stepped away from doesn't take kindly to being defied." "Neither do I," Omar replied with a wry smile. Despite the lingering challenges, Layla and Omar pressed forward. They knew the path they had chosen was not an easy one, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Together, they began laying the groundwork for a music and arts initiative aimed at supporting young talent from underprivileged backgrounds. The initiative, called Voices Unbound, was a reflection of their shared belief that art could break barriers and change lives. It was still in its early stages, but the passion behind it was undeniable. One evening, as they finalized plans for the initiative, Layla looked at Omar with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about where we started? The garden? The jasmine tree?" "Every day," Omar said, smiling. "It's where everything began." "And look where we are now," Layla said softly. "It feels surreal." "It's just the beginning," Omar said, taking her hand. "There's so much more to do." Layla nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. Together, they had defied expectations, overcome countless obstacles, and forged a path that was entirely their own. And though the journey ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: they were ready to face it, hand in hand. Months passed, and Voices Unbound began to take shape. Omar and Layla poured their energy into the initiative, transforming their shared vision into something tangible. Through the project, they offered music scholarships, mentorships, and platforms for young artists to showcase their work. It became a small but vibrant community of talent and resilience. The inaugural showcase of Voices Unbound was held in a modest hall. Layla performed alongside a group of young musicians, each of whom had been given a chance to shine through the initiative. The event was intimate yet electric, the performances a testament to the power of opportunity. After the final applause faded, Omar took the stage to address the audience. His words were heartfelt, speaking to the transformative power of art and the need to dismantle barriers that silence talent. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady. "We are here to show the world that greatness is not confined to privilege. It's found in the courage to create, the determination to rise, and the belief that everyone deserves a chance." In the days following the showcase, Layla's music began to attract attention on an international scale. Invitations to perform abroad trickled in, offering her opportunities she had once only dreamed of. One such invitation came from a renowned festival in Europe, a prestigious event that could cement her place among the world's top musicians. But accepting it would mean months away from Omar and their work on Voices Unbound. Late one evening, as they sat together reviewing plans for the next phase of the initiative, Layla hesitated before speaking. "I got an invitation," she began, her voice cautious. Omar looked up, intrigued. "Where to?" "It's a festival in Vienna," she said. "A huge opportunity, but it would mean leaving for a few months." A flicker of surprise crossed Omar's face, but he quickly smiled. "That's incredible, Layla. You have to go." "But what about everything here?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "The initiative, the work we've started." "This isn't just about here," Omar said gently. "You're part of this initiative because you're its heart. If you go, you're showing everyone what's possible. You'll inspire people in ways we never could from one place." Layla's chest tightened with emotion. "You really think so?" "I know so," Omar said. "This is your dream, Layla. You've worked too hard to hold back now." The weeks leading up to Layla's departure were a blur of preparation and bittersweet goodbyes. The night before she left, she and Omar visited the jasmine tree in the garden where their journey had begun. The air was cool, the scent of the blossoms faint but familiar. "I'm going to miss this," Layla said softly, her hand brushing against the bark of the tree. "And you?" "I'll miss you too," Omar said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But this isn't goodbye. It's just the next step." Layla looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "You could have," Omar said, a small smile playing on his lips. "But I'm glad I got to be a part of it." The morning of her departure arrived, and Omar stood at the train station, watching as Layla boarded. She leaned out of the window, her smile bright despite the tears in her eyes. "Keep the initiative going," she said. "Make it bigger, better." "Only if you promise to come back and see it," Omar replied, his grin matching hers. "Deal," she said as the train began to move. Omar stood on the platform, his heart heavy yet full of hope. He watched until the train disappeared into the horizon, knowing that while their paths were diverging for now, they would always be connected. In the months that followed, both Omar and Layla thrived. She dazzled audiences in Vienna, her performances celebrated as groundbreaking and evocative. Meanwhile, Omar expanded Voices Unbound, bringing in new partners and reaching more artists than ever before. Though their lives were busy and separate, they stayed in constant contact, sharing their successes and dreams. Each step they took was a testament to the choices they had made and the obstacles they had overcome. As Layla prepared to return home, she reflected on how far they had come from the jasmine tree to international stages, from a sheltered heir and a gardener's daughter to creators of a movement. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Together, they had changed paradigms.